So we're going to start with our Ohio to Erie updates, and we have Dean Babcock, who I saw was in the car, looked like, and Kathy Gunn
Yeah.
are going to give us updates. We have Dr. Bob, who's going to give us our history shorts for today, and then I'll be giving a short lecture on bee phenology, how we can expect to see different bees throughout the season. We have a couple bee updates. Lisa Lebovitz is going to talk about a growing degree day tool that she put together. And Bob Heath is also going to talk about how he uses phenology. And then we'll do our breakout groups. I have all the confidence that tech is going to be on my side today, get us into multiple breakout groups for a little bit of sharing before we adjourn at 11. So it's kind of our schedule today. And so, Dean, let's see if you're there. Go ahead and give us your update from Weston. You may have to orient folks a little bit where you are in the state and what you've been seeing.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah. Good. Yay. Actually, Denise had asked me to do this last week, but ironically, I was in, I left town. It was in Cincinnati for Wednesday and Thursday. So we put it off until this week. I was down there basically for a kickoff for the Barrows Conservation Lecture Series at the Cincinnati Zoo. And I have to confess, I initially kind of signed up as just an excuse to get out of Dodge. But the reason I'm bringing that up is I wanted a heads up for you folks. On June 2nd, my favorite entomologist, Dr. Olivia Carroll, is going to be the featured speaker. And you can go there live. They're at the Frisch's Conference Center at the zoo, or there's also an option to buy a virtual ticket. So you can Zoom it in real time, or I think they're going to have a link up for a month afterwards for the people. I think for $5, and you can get in and do that. So I was down for the last one. I've already rebooked my lovely Airbnb in Mount Adams. So I'm going to be down there June 2nd. Anybody else is down there and perhaps have a chance to run into each other. So just a heads up for that. Getting into the phenology here, I'd look to see where I was, as far as growing degree day units in Weston, which is about 5 miles west of Bowling Green, to orient everybody up there. And on the 28th, or at 2:39, the last actually the last 3 years, I've been lamenting the fact, since I've been trying to watch the bees in the spring. We have had just horrible, cold, wet springs for as long as I could remember. It seems I started looking up those dates, and I went back. I don't know, it's not showing up on my screen. I went down to 2016. You see where there. I was just kind of amazed at the variation. It's because we're in the hundreds. Actually, we're 100 more than we were last year, and that 2017 was 344 at this time, then back down to 223 in 2016. So it's no wonder that. Well, I mean, I feel confused with that variation. So it's no wonder that the springtime bee population seems sketchy up here. Even at this point, the red buds, which seem to, I always have the male carpenter bees, which is up there in the right-hand corner, seem to correspond. They're out at about the same time. I'm on the downside of the red buds, the bloom ending, and I just saw my first male carpenter bee outside my front door on Tuesday. I've had very little insect activity at all. It's just kind of crazy. So it's, and even actually up here on my butterfly transect, I have one in Oak Openings, and then I do one in southern Wood County. And I saw one impatiens queen up in Oak Openings, and just not seeing very much else at all. Just a few of the little seratinas. I think I found a Hylias. I have to. It's very tight. Of course, it was on a dandelion, and some of the little seratinas, the little carpenter bees. also on dandelion, but not much else. We had a breakout. I got called up to Toledo Botanical Gardens in their children's section, and they had a swarm of osmias, the cornifrons, the mason bees, which are general and harmless, but they needed to find out what those were so that all the kids wouldn't freak out, and it's the parents freaking out actually because it's the kids thing. Anyway, just kind of a quick run through of some of the things that are happening in my area. My witch hazel is out. That's kind of going on right now. Down in the bottom of that is the woodland phlox. Next to it is that's actually a bird's foot violet, which should be on the next page because that's a sand baron's obligate in oak openings. The reason for that would be the butterfly that's up there. It's a dusky wing, and there are broods that follow each one of there are different species, but they're really hard to differentiate in the field. But one of them is a sleepy, and this one is a dreamy. That's just like someone must have had Snow White on the brain when they were naming these, I guess. So I photographed those dusky wings nectaring on the bird's foot violet, which, by the way, is also a state listed plant. We monitor those for metro parks. Just one of my common yard violets down there. And on the right, I was really happy with this year. About 4 years ago, I planted 2 pawpaw trees. I have one that's at the west side of my house, and it gets a fair amount of sun. It's about 10 feet tall. I have another one that I planted under a redbud tree in my backyard about 25 yards away, and it's half as tall. But both of them are getting ready to flower this year, so I was all excited about that. They're just I was worried that the snow would take them, but they were all tightened up. They hadn't started to open at all during the snow event, and they have this is actually a photo from yesterday. So I think I have one flower that actually opened up. Down in my Wood County plot, there some of the woodland things, just more violets from my yard. The wild strawberries are out. They're right in the middle. They're full bloom. Up in the upper left-hand corner are bellworts, which is uvularia, I believe. There were hundreds of those. Normally they droop down. I took this photograph in a 21-mile-an-hour wind, so they're a little more horizontal. The flowers are more horizontal than they would normally be. And also up at oak openings, they haven't quite come out yet, but the lupin is getting ready to bloom as well. So, and I think, did I have any? I think that's it. So.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Dean. And I appreciate seeing all the rare areas you guys get to go to across the state. It's really inspiring to see all the places you're at. Kathy, I'm going to try to, are we going to share screen, Kathy, for your update?
That would work great.
Okay, let's see.
You said you were going to use my iNaturalist site. Is that going to work for you?
Well, I'm having some, do you have yours pulled up and we could share your screen to look at it? Having some internet slowness and I couldn't get it to pull up.
Oh gosh, okay. Well, let's see. I've got some things to talk about anyway.
Okay, I'll try to in the meantime.
Could show people. First of all, yes, Dean, I was at the talk about the baboons of Madagascar, and people do have to have a ticket just because of the social distancing thing. And I think there was a minor charge, but the woman who spoke, I can't remember her name. I don't want to say the wrong name, but she worked with the people of Madagascar to stop chopping down the rainforest and plant vanilla instead, because Madagascar vanilla is very prized. Another thing is, I don't know if people have really looked at our phenology project on iNaturalist, but the pictures are just so beautiful and so many different observations and so many interesting things. It's just been truly wonderful. But today I was going to talk about bees, and I am working on the bee specialist project with Melissa Spring. And I highly recommend the Bee Specialist Manual. I've used that a lot to find the specific plants I'm looking for, and then to actually notice what the specialist bees are. So this week, I was actually there, like I said, a few days ago, and I started looking on trees a little bit. I've been really surprised to see how many bees are on trees. I actually saw an Ohio buckeye tree yesterday that had a lot of nice bees on it. So yesterday, or a couple of days ago, I think I saw dogwood with Andrena, as you can see. And that a fleabane was already out. I was really surprised to see that. The geranium, the pink flower, is actually part of the Specialist Bee Project. I didn't collect yesterday though when I saw it. And then I'm trying to think of that Andrena, I believe, is on the buckeye tree. Further down the Agachlora, that is on Golden Alexander, which is part of the Specialist Bee Project. It looks to me like a little sweat bee. I was telling Denise, though, that I was looking at some willow that was just kind of in a random, not a very pretty spot, but it was on the list. And so I took some images, it's down here, of the willow tree and the area, and I collected some bees for the project, and I was posting my images to iNaturalist, and the researcher Melissa Spring happened to be on, and she said, "Did you net the bee?" And I was like, "Yeah, we did." And she said, "Well, that's one of the uncommon ones." And so I don't know exactly how uncommon it was, but it was pretty exciting. So I'm really nervous about those little guys down in my refrigerator. Trying to watch my time. I don't know. Otherwise, I've seen, yes, carpenter bees, seen sweat bees, and definitely I've seen a lot, some bees in the forest. And that was my other thought was, reading today and observing, I see a lot of bumblebees in the forest. And I was reading, they really like that habitat, like edge habitat, maybe like a field next to a forest. And just knowing that Ohio was almost completely forest when European settlers arrived, I kind of wonder if the disappearance of forest has anything to do with the decline of bumblebees. I mean, I don't know, but that's definitely where I see the queens in the spring is on the forest floor, sort of looking for nesting. You can see some of the other flowers, poppy, celandine poppy, definitely dandelion. I was surprised to learn that even though that's not a native necessarily, I guess there is a native dandelion, but that they're important for queen bumblebees as well. So that's that. Any questions?
Great, Kathy. Thank you so much. I wanted Kathy to talk about bees because she has an eye for the bees. Somehow she finds them. She's out there in the field a lot. And
this is my bee manual. So I don't know. I printed it out. It's really great. It's really readily available online. And this is my little book that I keep. I drew the Spring Beauty bee, and I put notes, how to identify the bee, how to identify the plant. So and then, for the bee project, this is I keep a log of the bees that I find. There's some information I have to fill in. I post pictures of the plant to iNaturalist to make sure that I'm looking at the right plant. And then I do collect the bees as well. That's all I have for you.
That's great, Kathy. Thanks so much. Really inspiring, all the time you're putting into those bee projects. And we'll post the Bee Specialist Manual and also the Bee Guide that Melissa Spring worked on week 4 of our course website, so that everybody has access to those excellent guides. So we are up to our history shorts with Dr. Bob. Dr. Bob Heath, you should be able to share your screen. You want to take it away?
Yeah, let's see if I can. Let's do this. Can you see that screen there? Let's see. So you should be seeing a graph.
Yes, we can see it.
Good.
Great, thank you. What I'm going to do today is talk about how these long-term studies, these phenological studies done over 50, 60 years, can help us with the way that we think about the changing landscape. And so, first of all, this is the way that we're thinking. You know that the Julian date is the day of the year. So Julian date 31 or January 31 is Julian date 31. February 1st is Julian date 32, and so on and so forth. And so what we see here is, you know, it's winter, and then finally we get a day or two that's a little bit above 50 degrees. So we start adding growing degree days, and it comes about. And so let's suppose something happens on growing degree date 100, then we would say it's on that date. And the way that we're looking, the way that at least I think that we're thinking, or at least the way I think I'm thinking, is that I'm picturing global climate change this way: is, well, you know, here's the new date. So this might have been the green one might have been 50 years ago, and here we are today, and it's we're reaching day 100 or growing degree date 100, and so we see that it's earlier in the year, and that's the premise we've been looking at. But as I thought about it, there's another way that we could do the same thing. It might be this way, that we have a shorter winter, and so things start growing sooner, and it gets warm, and warms up, and so we would have the growing degree day here. Once again, it's earlier, and so on and so forth. So those are two different things to think about, and this is the way that scientists often work, as we try to model, this would be a model, try to model what we're thinking about, and we see, there are two different ways of thinking about this. So we'll go to the data, and we see, this is from the article that you read for today's assignment, or that you'll read this afternoon for today's assignment. And when you look at this, what they have done here is over 50 years. So they've taken the average between 19 in this 10-year sequence and compared it with the average in the 2006 to 2015 average time for first leaf among lilacs. And you say, well, there are a lot of varieties of lilacs. They were very careful to use clones of lilacs to remove the genetic element. And when you look at this map, you see that the orange dots are where things are coming out earlier, and the blue dots are where things are coming out later than they would be. And you'd say, well, climate's warming. And so I would expect, as we have seen in our study here, that things come out sooner. And as much as, say, 8 days sooner, there are a couple little dots where they're coming out later, but that's to be expected. You have things. And so when you look at this map, you'd say, okay, that's what I would expect. The climate is warming, and therefore the first leaf date is sooner. But then I get to this. Whoa, this wasn't what I was expecting at all. Here in the Southeast, things are coming out later. How can that be? Based on my model that we were just talking about, it would imply that it's gotten colder in the South rather than warmer. And so I think, well, is that so? So I go to the USDA plant hardiness zone map, and I see, well, all of these zones have moved further north, and the South is no exception. The Southeast has also warmed, just as the rest of the nation has. So then I have to wonder, anybody have any ideas? Well, here's an idea. Now, if this was a classroom, this is where we would stop and talk, and I want the students to hypothesize, and I'd reward them for trying out an answer. Unfortunately, we can't do that here, so I'm just going to throw out an idea and take it for what it's worth. This isn't gospel. It's just an idea. And so I'm saying, as with the cherry blossoms that we talked about a couple of weeks ago, the cherry blossoms in Japan and in Washington, D.C., as the winters warm, they shorten the time of diapause. And a lot of plants need a certain duration of diapause in order to physiologically function correctly. You might say they need to have their winter sleep so that they can wake up in the springtime ready to grow forth. And we see that then as with the cherry blossoms, as the winters warm and thereby shorten, the bloom times actually become later. So the question I'm asking here is, could later blooming indicators indicate that warmer winters have shortened the diapause duration and leading to a later leaf and bloom times? So looking at this picture, one of the things that I think we have to spend more attention to, or at least that I have to give more attention to, is when does this start and how long are the winters? So as a phenological, I guess you would call it a phenopause. I forget exactly what they call it, but a phenological event is to be very careful to measure the duration of the winter and to see if it's starting early, then it may be that physiologically the plant, instead of having its first leaf out on growing degree day 100, it might say move up to growing degree day 200, and that would then make it come out later. So it's just a thought. It's one of the ways in which scientists would use this string of data to propose new things to look at. And that's it. I'm going to stop sharing right there. And if there are any questions, I don't think I've used up too much of my time. The baking effect. Diapause for plants. I see someone Karen put that in, and Chuck, the baking effect. Chuck, what is the baking effect? What were you thinking of there? You can unmute if you want. We're not.
It's easy for you to say. I meant that the plants in the South are getting cooked.
Right. Oh, I see. That it was too warm, and therefore they had to bloom later. Yeah, that is, your thought, the thought that I gave, and the thought that others would give. those are what are called testable hypotheses. We would figure out, well, is that the way it's working? And so all of these things, the phenological records and what we've looked at in terms of the data analysis leads us to think about new things. So one of the things that I wanted to present over this series of 3 historical things is the way that we use the history. And in fact, the way that we use what we're doing here will be useful in, say, 50 years or so. So keep those cards and letters coming in, folks. And that's it.
Great. Thanks so much, Dr. Bob Heath. I appreciate you taking on these history shorts for us and giving us some well-needed scientific perspective, posing some great questions. Let's see. So we're going to move into some bee phenology now. And once I share my screen, I'm a little limited as far as what I can see. So if there's something that comes up in the chat or some issues, please somebody jump in and let me know. Try to get the right screen to share. You would think the more Zoom happens, the easier it gets, but I have a feeling there are updates that are a little bit beyond me. Just a sec. Okay, I think this is the right screen. So hopefully you're seeing my screen there with bee phenology and the bee watcher's garden. So we're going to talk a little bit about how bees progress through the season, how we can use seasonality to help with identification, and also some ideas for some plants that you can use as indicators to keep track of bees. And so we know that bees are the most important pollinators of all. A lot of you have different levels of experience with bees, bee identification, and bee biology. So we're going to just really skim the surface here. But bees, because of their diet and adaptations, are really key in the pollinator world. And we don't know how many species we have in Ohio. Kathy mentioned the Specialist Bee Project. So that's a special project looking at special plants that have a unique relationship with bees to try to get an idea how many of those bees are in Ohio. Some of you may have participated in the bee survey last year. Again, trying to figure out exactly how many species of bee do we have in Ohio. Maybe 400 or more species. We're not exactly sure. But we do have a lot of seasonality with our bees. And that means that we can take the time of year as a helpful hint to help us figure out which bees we might be seeing in the landscape, either which bees to look for, or if we're looking at a bee, which bee that might be. And I'll use a birding analogy. So since I think a lot of you are probably birders, and we know that different birds are active at different times of year. Here I've pulled up some common waterfowl in Ohio, about 60 different species. And we know with our waterfowl, some are active throughout the season, while as others are migratory species that we may only see at certain times of year. So here, if we look at a bufflehead, this is from iNaturalist, and we'll look at a few of these different examples from iNaturalist, where if you pull up the species, whether it's an insect, a bird, a plant, you get this glimpse of the seasonality there on iNaturalist, which can be really helpful, and you can customize that by your location. And we'll talk about that a little bit and how you could use that. So in this example of bufflehead, we see them early in the season as they're migrating north, and then we would see them later in the season in Ohio as they migrate through again. Of course, our bees don't migrate, but we do have different activity periods. Here are some of our early season bees, which we've mentioned before: the queen bumble bees, the mason bees, and the polyester bees, for example, bees that we tend to see early in the season, but not exclusively, and we'll talk about some different examples as well. So I like to pull up this guide that focuses on orchard crops in the Northeast. And so here we have the crops that growers may be interested in: apple, plum, peach, and cherry. Of course, we need good pollination to get good fruit harvest. And so we need to know which bees are important for growers throughout that bloom period. And so if we look here, of course, these are calendar dates, but we have these different bees that span different periods. and then overlap with key bloom time here for apple in those crops. And so we can see that some bees are going to be active quite early, even before our apples, for example, are in bloom, whereas others are kind of come out a little later. These are just a few of our wild bee species. We would have lots and lots of other species. In fact, over 120 some bees that have been identified on apples, for example, in the Northeast. So lots of possible bee diversity. If we looked at different crops, let's say we wanted to think about pumpkins or squash, they would have a later bloom period and also a different suite of bees that would be important as pollinators. So the plants are really important when we're talking about bee phenology. And also the life cycle of the bee really falls in line with that. So often when we think about bees, we think of social bees, our honeybees and bumblebees, primary examples in Ohio, although we have other social bees. But they tend to have they have a colony, they have a queen, workers, and drones. And they tend to have a long span of life of that, or activity of adults of that colony. They tend to be generalists as far as what plants they're foraging on. So that means they don't have just one certain kind of plant that they forage on, because the colony is active over multiple weeks and months. That colony has to switch off from one plant species to another to have enough stable food to continue to have a healthy colony. Most of the bees in the world, though, are solitary bees, and of those, most are solitary ground nesting bees. Those solitary bees may only have an activity period about 6 weeks or so when they're active as adults. And we can have specialists in those solitary bees, or we can have generalists. So they're not all specialists, but many are, and many are going to a wider variety of plants. So let's look at our bumblebees as an example. We've, a lot of us seen queen bumblebees out, and we've noted how similar they can look to carpenter bees. I think Kathy mentioned the shiny hiney there, or maybe it was Carolyn mentioned the hairs on the bumblebees versus the shiny hiney we'll see in a minute on carpenter bees. So one easy way to distinguish the two, if you can get a good look at that. So from a bee phenology perspective, we're going to see queens early in the season, and we're seeing them now. We're only going to see them for another few weeks in the spring. Then those queens will go underground. Here's an image I love to show of all these queen bumblebees active on crocus in the spring. So the queens are much, much larger than the workers. We see them early, and then soon those queens are going to head underground exclusively, and they'll be down in that colony. The queen, only one queen per colony. Queen is laying eggs, and her daughters, the workers, are helping to gather food and clean that colony, rear the offspring, feed the offspring. And so in that colony cycle, then new queens are produced late summer or fall, and then those new queens emerge, mate with one drone, and then that new queen survives next year. So the only time we're going to see queen bumblebees in Ohio will be early in the spring, when she emerges from that hibernacula, starts to set up that colony. She is actively foraging. Then she's going to be underground, and then she dies, and new queens emerge in the fall. So early in the spring and then later summer into fall are the periods when we would see queen bumblebees in Ohio. The workers we're going to see anytime now. I wonder if down in Cincinnati, those workers are getting ready to emerge. The workers are much smaller than the queen, so that's one way that we can tell them from that great big queen, about as big as your thumb. And if we look at the iNaturalist seasonality chart, the phenology chart that I mentioned before, this is for the common eastern bumblebee, so our most common species in Ohio. We can see that we have early season emergence. This would be the queen. This is based on observations, images, photos that people have uploaded to iNaturalist. And again, I've pulled out Ohio for that. So we have queen activity early in the spring. And then we start to see the workers emerge and kind of peak here in summer. They're active late summer and into the fall. We can see particularly males and some leftover worker bumblebees up through November, or times when we have a really cold snap in the fall. So a pretty wide season of activity for those adult bumblebees. They need lots of different foods, lots of different plants to forage on to keep them going. And we do see different stages throughout the year. Another bee, so this is the large carpenter bee that can look similar to our queen bumblebees, similar in size in the spring. And this is that shiny hiney that is one easy way to distinguish the carpenter bees from the bumblebees. Carpenter bees are considered primitively social, so they do have some characteristics of sociality, but they don't necessarily have queens or drones, but they have males and females. Excuse me. And so they overwinter in those wood galleries. Here in the railing here are the carpenter bees galleries. What we see on the edge here is activity by woodpeckers, right? So the woodpeckers could sense those carpenter bees in there and came and chewed out that wood. So the damage the carpenter bees do is up inside along the grain of that wood. So as Dean mentioned, those large carpenter bees we see early in the spring, they actually overwinter as adults in those wood galleries. And as soon as days are warm enough for them to be out and to forage, as soon as plants are blooming, then we see those large carpenter bees. They're mating then in spring. So we saw them, a lot of times the males are territorial. They're coming to guard the entrance to their colony or to their the nest site. They're trying to keep away other males, and they're also mating. And then the female is visiting flowers to provision for that next generation of offspring. So if we look at, again, the iNaturalist seasonality chart, we see activity early in the spring. Those are the overwintering carpenter bees. Then we tend to not observe quite as many. And then the newly emerged adults from that generation from this year are active all the way through into early fall. So a long season of a long period when we could observe these large carpenter bees. They're generalist foragers. They're visiting lots of different kinds of food. So we're not going to see them on one certain kind of plant, although they have some preferences, but they have a wide range of food sources because they have a long time that they're provisioning cells, a long period of activity. So let's turn to our ground nesting solitary bees, and this is an example of an Andrena mining bee is an example of a solitary ground nesting bee. We notice this bee sometimes by the hairy armpits, the pollen that's carried in the legs and close to the body. Andrena tend to be active early in the spring, although there are other species that are active later, and we'll look at those as well. But they nest in tunnels underground. They're solitary. That means they're just moms and dads. They don't have queens. They don't communicate with each other. And while it looks like they're all swarming together, they can't communicate. They can't, they're actually quite docile. They don't sting to defend their nest sites. And unless you hold a female, she's very unlikely to sting, they're actually quite docile. So when she emerges, she cleans out that tunnel and then mates, gathers pollen and nectar. That is the bee bread that she puts down in that little cell. She lays an egg on there, and then the egg hatches out into the larva. The larva eventually pupates and then emerges around the same time next year. So these adult females never meet their offspring. They're doing all the work kind of at the beginning of the lifespan. And then the adults die, and then the new adults emerge around the same time phenologically next year. Okay, and so we can use plant bloom to help give us cues for when we may be seeing those different bees. It doesn't necessarily mean that these are specialists, but they, when these plants bloom, it may be the period that these mining bees are active. So here's a mining bee that's foraging on a shrub dogwood, and we can guess that that shrub dogwood pollen is actually orange because we see that orange mast in those hairs. So if we look at the group of Andrena, the genus Andrena, and just like Quercus is the genus for oaks, there are lots of different kinds of oaks, but we can talk about oaks in general. So Andrena is the genus. There are lots of different species of Andrena, of mining bees. But if we look at the genus in general, and this is from, I'll show you this resource in a minute. This is a set of phenology graphs that Sam Drogy's lab put together that looked at museum specimens across the mid-Atlantic states. And when are we seeing these Andrena mining bees? So in general, the genus Andrena. And we see here that most Andrenas are seen March, April, and May in mid-Atlantic states. And then other species seen later in the season. So let's turn to polyester bees. Again, many of you have been seeing polyester bees out in the landscape this spring. These are a common solitary ground nesting bee. Here they have a kind of a striped abdomen, a fairly large size. They're not quite as big as a honeybee, but larger than some of our small mining bees. And they, again, nest kind of together in aggregations, but they don't work together. They don't care for each other's young. They really have that solitary life cycle. And so each of these little tunnel entrances is used by one female. She goes down into that tunnel and provisions cells underground for her offspring, which will emerge next year around the same time. Okay, so we can use that plant phenology to give us an idea of when these bees may emerge. This site here is at the Toledo Botanical Garden, and I don't get to Toledo, well, not very often these days, but normally maybe once a year I get to Toledo. And if I'm going to the Botanical Garden, I want to get there around the time that star magnolias are in bloom, because that's an indicator to me that those polyester bees may be active. Okay, that doesn't mean that star magnolias are necessarily a forage, a food source for these bees. It just means that those two occurrences happen to be in sync, and I can use that plant bloom as an indicator for when I might see those polyester bees. Okay, I could also look at the growing degree day number. I could look up on the calendar and get a feel for what that number would be when I first noticed those species. But keep in mind that your plant indicators are a good, strong, and kind of a powerful memory tool to help you keep track of what's going to be emerging when. Okay. So again, if I go back to iNaturalist, and I told you I would talk about how we can kind of change the location so you can get sort of a more customized feel for what is happening in your part of the world. And this is that polyester bee, that Colletes inequalis that was at the Toledo Botanical Garden. So I looked up this species, and then I just changed the county location. So I did Campbellton County, where Kathy is down in Cincinnati, and I did Geauga County. Mary Brennan and others live in east of Cleveland. Now, note that there aren't a lot of observations. And so, Dr. Bob, as a scientist, would tell us that we really need more observations to get a good feel for the phenology of this polyester bee in Geauga County. But this just gives us an idea. Here in Hamilton County, we have 23 observations all told for this bee. And look here, here's Kathy, our top observer of that bee, with 6 observations. So I use this just to kind of give you a feel for, we talked about those calendar dates and how so in Cincinnati, they're starting to see the polyester bees as early as February, kind of peaking in March and sort of done by May. And here in Geauga County, so significantly further north in the state, really not seeing those bees until March, sort of peaking in April, and again done by May. So just, a way to kind of look across the state and see when would we see different species. You can do this with plants as well on iNaturalist, a bird or other organisms that you're interested in. So there are more than just that one species of cellophane bee. In the state, we have about 24 different species. And so when I look up the genus of Colletes, so all the different kinds of polyester bees in the state that have been observed on iNaturalist, I see that we have kind of this peak emergence in spring. So these are species that are active in spring. And then we have other species that are coming out in fall. So the spring Colletes tend to be generalists. They're going to lots of different plants. And then we do have some specialists, which I'll talk about in just a minute, that are active later in the season. So I don't want to make this as complicated as it is. Bees are really difficult to identify. And many of you have been studying and learning and practicing and collecting, pinning and identifying bees for quite a while, and can appreciate that it's tough to identify bees. We have lots of different kinds of bees. They're quite small. Some of the details that we use to identify them to species can be quite difficult to see. We may need a microscope. And so I don't want you to be discouraged if you're new to the world of bees, but just know that the phenology of when bees are active is one additional tool that you can use to help you get a feel for what bee you might be seeing. And when you add observations to iNaturalist, it's this kind of information that the artificial intelligence is using. What have others seen nearby and around this time to give you suggestions for what the identity of your observation may be. So a couple, another early season bee, excuse me, are the, pardon me, are the mason bees. Mason bees are solitary cavity nesting bees. We often think of them nesting in artificial blocks or houses that can be used out in orchards or in the landscape to help with pollination. They, the females have hairs under the abdomen. That's where they collect and carry the pollen, usually a fairly dry pollen on that abdomen. And again, we have about 22 different species of osmia in the state. So if we look at that whole collection, all those species, the genus osmia, we can see that most of them are active in spring, but we do have a few species that are active in fall. So once we can learn to identify a species like osmia, then we can use the time of year to help us figure out what bee, which specific mason that may be, depending on when we're seeing them. And if we go back to our chart of orchard bloom and different pollinators, we see mason bees here. They're really an important pollinator of orchard crops, of fruit crops, and really overlapping well with our key orchard trees. Active very early in the season, and they're excellent pollinators. They're able to work lots and lots of flowers where other bees aren't quite as efficient as those mason bees. Of course, we could follow out all through the year and look at lots of different species of bee, others that are summer active, some that are active later into the fall. So here's just an example of a summer active bee that you might see, the bicolored striped sweat bee. In the genus Agapostemon, they tend to have here the pollen collecting hairs here on the legs for this female, a green head and thorax and a striped abdomen, and kind of a longer flight period as an adult. So we may see this bee over a period of months in the summer as they forage in our landscapes. So let's talk about those specialist bees. So phenologically, specialist bees have a very tight relationship with certain kinds of plants. Kathy mentioned the geranium and the specialist bee that visits geranium. These are squash bees. And so squash bees have a specific relationship with the pollen of cucumbers, gourds, squash, and pumpkins. That is, the female squash bees will only visit those plants to gather pollen to provision cells for their young. These are solitary ground nesting bees. The females gathering that pollen, often right there in the pumpkin field, nesting in that pumpkin field if the soil is suitable and it's not tilled to destroy her tunnels. She's gathering that pollen and taking it right underground. The male squash bee are actually good pollinators. We don't often think of males as being good pollinators in the bee world because they're not actively gathering pollen. But in this case, the male is hanging out in the flower. They use them as little bachelor pads. They hang out in those flowers overnight, waiting for the flower to open in the morning for those females to come drink. There's copious nectar in those flowers and gather that pollen, and the male's there ready to hopefully mate with her. So they actually do a fairly good job of transferring that pollen around. And if we look at the seasonality of squash bees on iNaturalist in Ohio, we see, really nice correlation with when we would expect pumpkins and gourds and squash to be in bloom, beginning in June, really peaking there in July and August. And that's the flight activity of those adult squash bees. So a few years ago, I had a grower call me, not a professional grower, but kind of a backyard, but large scale pumpkin grower who wanted to improve her pumpkin pollination. And so she was going to start to keep some mason bee houses. Okay. And so I talked to her about how, the mason bee zone of activity when they're really out as adults is totally out of sync with those squash plants. And so in June, July, and August, mason bees are tucked back inside their little tunnels as larvae, then to overwinter, to pupate and overwinter as adults, ready to emerge early in the spring to forage those early season crops. So not a good pollinator for that specific crop. There are other pollinators that are much more important for pumpkin, gourd, and squash, like worker bumblebees, honeybees, and our squash bees. So another specialist bee, we already talked about polyester bees, but this is a fall active polyester bee, or Colletes, in the genus Colletes, that has to visit, it's a specialist on goldenrod. So this female will only visit goldenrod to gather that pollen and provision those underground cells. Many of you know that they're called polyester bees because the females have a gland on their abdomen that they can coat that little nursery cell underground. So it forms kind of a cellophane-like coating, a polyester-like coating on that little nursery cell to protect the larva, or the bee bread and the egg, which later hatches into the larva, and the larva eating that bee bread, eventually pupating to emerge next year. So that's the polyester part of the polyester bees. If we go back to the phenology on iNaturalist of cellophane bees in general in the genus Colletes, we see we have that early season activity, and then here's where our specialist on goldenrod would emerge later in the season. Another kind of mining bee are aster mining bees. These are bees that they're solitary mining bees, but foraging specifically on asters for that pollen. If we look at season of activity of adults for aster mining bee on iNaturalist in Ohio, we see that they're peaking in September. Okay, and which correlates, as we would imagine, with the peak bloom of asters. The difference here is whether they're research grade or casual observed, but lots of aster observations are, really in sync then with that aster mining bee. And these specialist bees are hardwired so that even if they're taken into a laboratory, artificially reared on a different kind of pollen, when they emerge as adults, the females automatically go back. They're hardwired to that plant that they're a specialist on. So they have a really specific and unique relationship with those plants. And again, looking at that chart from Sam Droege, most Andrena species active in the spring, but a few species that are active later in the summer, like our aster specialist. So here's an Andrena specialist that many of you have observed on our project, the OSU Phenology Fridays, the Spring Beauty Miner. And look, here's Kathy Gunn with 13 observations. She's the top observer of this bee in Ohio. And so we see this bee starting in February, March, really peaking in April across the state. And then we shouldn't, after May, won't see this bee as our Virginia Spring Beauty is done blooming. And so we can see this bloom period really in sync with the activity period of that bee. So it's interesting about specialist bees. Often we think that they must be the best pollinators of those plants, but they are not necessarily. This was a study done a couple years ago that looked at those spring beauty mining bees and showed that they were so good at collecting the pollen, they actually depleted the pollen, not leaving a lot of pollen for other visitors like bee flies that turn out to be pretty good pollinators of that plant. So just because a bee is a specialist bee, it doesn't mean it's the key or the most important pollinator. It just means that it has a special food relationship and has to have that pollen. So again, going back to our project on iNaturalist, so far, about 155 of you have seen 19 different species of bees. Some of these bees we talked about. Here's our spring beauty miner. Here's our polyester bees. Some of our bumblebee queens that we've started to see, our carpenter bees. These nomad bees are really interesting. I didn't talk so much about these kleptoparasitic or cuckoo bees, but they have a parasitic relationship with a certain genus of bee. So in this example, the nomad bee are parasites of Andrenas, so not necessarily the spring beauty miner, but Andrenas in general. And these cuckoo bees actually watch the Andrena mining bees as they're going in and out of that tunnel in the ground. The cuckoo bees then wait for the adult female to fly out, that Andrena bee, and then the nomad goes in, she lays her eggs in there. The Andrena comes back, she's none the wiser. She seals up that cell with the bee bread and her egg, not realizing there's that cuckoo bee egg in there. Cuckoo bee eggs generally hatch faster. They have a sickle-like mouth part in their first instar. And so they either destroy the egg or the larva of that Andrena and then eat the bee bread. So that's the klepto part. They steal the food from that host bee. And so, as you would imagine, these kleptoparasites also have a specific relationship phenologically with the bees that they prey on, right? They would emerge around the same time. They visit the same plants not to collect pollen, right? Those kleptoparasites don't collect pollen. They may drink a little bit of nectar, but they're really visiting those plants to watch for their prey, the Andrena bees, and then follow them back to where they're nesting. So if we kept coming back to this project throughout the summer and into the fall, we could see then a real progression of bees that have been noted across the state by those of you out there taking pictures of them. We'd get a real sense for the phenology of those bees throughout the season in Ohio. So notice that honeybees are right here with 10 observations so far. They usually are way up there on all those bee observation projects on iNaturalist because there's so many honeybees out there. But I didn't really mention them as far as phenology goes, and that's because honeybees are sort of a different sort in the bee world. They, of course, they have a perennial colony. They burn honey. They eat honey to generate heat, and that heat keeps the colony at consistent temperatures through the winter, spring, actually year round, right? So they're able to regulate that hive temperature. And that makes them less dependent on ambient air temperature. They just need 55-degree air temperatures to fly. They don't need those air temperatures to develop because they're able to maintain that hive temperature by using the fuel of honey to keep the hive going. So it's not as reliable to use phenology as we talk about it, growing degree days, to track honeybee activity. Because the bees are almost always flying if it's sunny and 55 degrees. But beekeepers do definitely use our calendar extensively. They use it to track bloom time. They add in their own plants that they're interested in, because that's when their honeybees are going to be bringing back that nectar, when they need to get the honey supers on, if they're trying to prevent swarming or bring in a specific kind of honey. So a different use for beekeepers using that plant phenology, not so much to track their honeybee development, but to track bloom time and plan some hive activity, some hive maintenance and attending. So I just wanted to end quickly with an idea of a bee garden, a bee watcher's garden that you may want to incorporate some of these different plants if you're trying to see different bees. And so having a span of bloom throughout the season will invite different kinds of bees into your garden. Some plants are just easier to observe bees on. So we've seen lots of bees on ephemeral wildflowers if you have the habitat to do that, or maybe some early spring bulbs. If you can grow pussy willows or have maples with flowers down lower, it's hard to see the flowers way up there in the canopy, but to be able to observe those early bees on those early trees. Redbud, apples and cherries, really excellent for bees. Apples and cherries, the mason bees, also Andrena, mining bee, our polyester bees are going to be very happy on redbud. I've also seen them on apples. Some of our weeds, clover and dandelion, and then lots of our summer perennials, early season monardas through lobelias, thistles, coneflowers, goldenrods, asters. If you can kind of span that season with some of those perennials, you're going to invite a nice bee diversity. So again, I guess my goal is not, or my hope is that you don't all get worried about having to identify the bees, but more appreciate what's out there, being able to take in bee diversity and learn a few bees here and there, kind of add to your knowledge about bees, add a few observations onto iNaturalist, and slowly improve BID. It's a difficult hobby or skill or science, but it's just amazing. There's so much bee diversity and beauty out there in our bees and the plants that they forage on. So I just wanted to put this slide up to show you there are a couple slide sets on SlideShare from Sam Droege that really run through the phenology of various bee species or genera. You can see here about 145 different slides that show those phenology graphs. So a quick thank you to my Zoom mates for not barking or snoring too loudly while I was going. Let me turn on my chat box and just see if we had any quick questions. Oh, Mary Brennan mentions the image that I had up with the span of flowers in the bee watcher's garden is the butterfly garden there at Holden Arboretum, one of the best places in the state to watch bees and butterflies and others, but a great diversity of flowers spanning that season, lots of colors and shapes and sizes of the plants and also the bee visitors. Great. Okay, so we're doing great on time. I'm gonna, let's see. I think I've already made, Lisa, I think I've made you a co-host. So I'm gonna turn the floor over to Lisa Lebovitz, who is a volunteer pollinator specialist, a master OCVN naturalist in Medina, and has been working to improve her skills on bee identification and bee biology, spent a lot of time out in the field. She's participated in that bee survey last year and the bee specialist survey this year. And she's been working a lot on iNaturalist and bees with growing degree dates. So Lisa, I will turn the floor over to you so you can share what you've been doing.
Thanks, Denise.
And did you, I forget if you were going to share your screen or did you want me to pull that file up?
I think you were going to pull the file up.
Okay, go ahead and I'll pull it up in just a sec here.
So while Denise is pulling up the list, I will say there were several factors that led me to create the Ohio bee list, but it really boiled down to two main reasons. One being that I love observing and studying these fascinating creatures. I'm also really interested in the identification of the species and seeing them in detail. And I'm very, very new at bee identification. I just started in 2019 with the pollinator specialist course. So it's when we were all getting together and there were microscopes and hand holding and bee experts, it was great. And when that disappeared, I went on to take the 2020 course and try to do some self-study using iNaturalist to help me look at pictures and learn how to ID. But I found that to be challenging, and it was beginning to become very overwhelming. But I still love bee identification and I want to improve my skills. So I thought, well, I'll just wait until 2021 when we can all get together again. And there are microscopes and hand holding and bee experts. And when I discovered that that was not to be, I knew I needed a tool to help me organize these bees in a visually organized way that I can approach them one by one and study each of them, you know, as I come across them. So I reached out to Denise and to Melissa Spring to see if any such list existed. And they sent me some resources, and looking through them, it wasn't exactly what I had in mind. Because the second part of the main reason why I decided to create this list was because of a new hobby I have acquired. I've decided I enjoy the bee so much. I'd like to have a bee list, a life list, a checklist, much like the birding list. So instead of, in addition to looking for birds and birding, I'm going to go on a bee quest to see if I can find as many of the known species in Ohio as I can over a lifetime. So that's why I decided to come up with this list, because there was nothing really specifically out there that kind of met these criteria. So I'll quickly walk you through the list itself. So the first column is that checklist to support the hobby of going to, you know, different gardens or my backyard. Some species I might see in a museum collection, but that way I can actually see them. And
Lisa, you're muted.
okay, where did I leave off? Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you now. And
we just lost you for a second or two, Lisa.
Okay, so you see the checklist, the first column, and then the next three columns are related to how I decided to organize the list. Because there are so many bees, I decided to use iNaturalist as my jumping off point. I'd been in the Ohio Bee Atlas a lot. So basically this list is all of the bees within that Ohio Bee Atlas on iNaturalist, and I've put them in order of their first appearance according to GDD data. And I'll explain to you how I arrived at that, but that was the best way that I could think of for myself to make it not so overwhelming. I really like phenology because it gives me a beginning place, and I thought that'd be a wonderful way to approach these bees as when they first start coming out, and I can kind of be looking for them, and there's maybe a handful of bees to study at once instead of 160 plus that are listed on iNaturalist. So using the GDD data, I decided I went all the way back to 2010, and I pulled up for each bee all of the observation dates from 2010. And then I brought it all the way up to 2020, although I did just update the bees that have currently come out up to this last week. So then for each of those bees, I took all of those observations and I picked out the first observation of each year. I took that data and I found the date, obviously, and then the zip code of that observation. And I plugged it into the OSU GDD calendar, growing degree day calendar, and came up with a number. And then from all of those numbers, I picked the lowest number and I put that on my list. And so what you see here are the bees listed according to that data as it appeared on iNaturalist based on observations. So while it's not exact, because we're dependent on when people get out and actually make these first observations, it gives a really good idea. And I found it, looking at all those many years of data, to be really encouragingly consistent. So the first three columns, I also, when I'm in the field or when I first in the field, when I see these bees, I want to record my own GDD data because I would like to track that over the years. I've already been tracking GDD numbers for the last year in our naturalist notebook that we got in the 2019 course. And I find it very helpful and very interesting. And see, monitor changes or whatever. I also think that GDD evens the playing field a bit. When someone sees the first queen bees in Cincinnati, I get excited. I start looking for them, but my weather is very different in Northeast Ohio. So it helps a lot more for me to see the GDD date of when that person saw, so I can be looking for that in my area.
Lisa, I'm sorry, probably just another minute or so to kind of summarize, if you don't mind.
Sure. So, and then the rest is fairly explanatory. The micro ID, thank you to Melissa Spring for suggesting that. And she went in and plugged in whether these bees need a microscope or a hand lens to identify. And then thank you to Denise for suggesting that I put a column in for the flowers that the bees are visiting, and also a way to take down notes of what else is out there at the same time that's in bloom. So I also put a column for specialist bees. It's highlighted, and I added the flowers that the specialists visit, and that's the list. And that's all. Thanks.
Wow, thanks, Lisa. So what a great resource. I was so excited that Lisa put the time in to do this, a really big winter project to correlate all those zip codes in the growing degree days with those observations across the state. So we will share this this file. Lisa has kindly offered to share this. So those of you who might want to print this out and take your own notes on it. And thanks, Lisa, for sharing that. We're going to have, then Bob Heath is going to talk about how he uses phenology.
Let's see. Yeah. Oh, wait a second. Yeah, let me, I'm not so sure this is what I wanted to show. I had a, let's go down. Oh, let's see. Let's see. Let me pull up the file I wanted to pull up. And let's see. No, that's not it. Okay. Yeah, here we go. Okay. Can you see that now? This is what I'm doing, and I
Bob, I don't see it yet.
Oh, you don't? Okay, let's go back here. I might have stopped. Okay, let's screen share and then do this. Can you see that now?
Yep, we see it now. And I just want to let you know you've only got 5 minutes.
Okay, well, I'll talk twice as fast as I normally would. First of all, I use a large spreadsheet. I put it in Excel, and I've done this for several years, and I know you can't see that, so I'll show you just part of it. I try to keep all of the physical data. So this is the date. I keep the date, and that's year, month, and then day. This is the Julian date. So I keep that. So if I want to plot something, I use this as the x-axis. And then I keep day length. Day length, of course, doesn't change from year to year. So I keep day length, meaning the minutes from sunrise to sunset. And then I also each year keep track of the growing degree date, as well as the minimum and maximum temperature on site, as well as rainfall and snowfall. And then along the column headings, I keep garden flowers, wildflowers, garlic. We raise garlic, and so I try to look at that. Crops, trees, bushes. I keep bonsai, so I keep track of that. And especially I keep track of bees and bumblebees and other animals, like when the spring peepers come out and when the fireflies come out. And I use this over several years. I've used it to ask the question, does growing degree date really work? And you can see in the case of daffodils, yeah, they're all coming out pretty much at the same time. Lungworts, yeah. Forsythia, yeah, pretty much. The crabapple, yeah, pretty much. But some things don't. And like the violets and the rhododendron that we have that bumblebees really like, the bumblebee queens really love, I'm not so sure about. So it's something I'm going to look at over the years, and it's one way that I keep track of things. So this is the value of a spreadsheet. You can easily compare year to year. Another way that I do it is I have a photographic phenological record where I keep, this is the growing degree date. Hazelnut blooms come out, coltsfoot comes out on growing degree date 53, and so on and so forth. Ramps, I always want to know when the ramps are going to come, so I keep that. Another thing that I keep is a landscape growing degree date. So this is a growing degree date 80. There's 89, 168. You can see it's always trying to set up the same scene, 202, 220, it's starting to get kind of green. And then 228, and this is just the other day, 235 and 244. So that's about where we are right now. And that's it. I think I stayed within my allotted time slot, Denise.
You did, Bob. Thank you so much. And I really appreciate everyone who shared today, Dean and Kathy, Lisa, and Bob twice. I think having everyone give elements to the lecture has been a really positive and strong piece. I love how everyone has different interests and uses phenology to help learn more. So we're going to do some quick breakout rooms, again, about 10 minutes. So you can spend some time updating what's going on in your neck of the woods. And here we go. We'll adjourn after our breakout rooms.